some of you have come for the first time, so let me quickly mention that we have already had, by this time, 8 talks here. First one was general introduction, and then 4 mostly based on death in the great traditions, and then after that I'll have 4 occasions. 3 have already been taken, so this is the 4th one about love in great traditions, and then the next 2 times is a kind of a summarizing them really also. So today I'll be speaking about love in the Indian tradition, and largely focusing on the Bhagavad Gita, which many of you have heard me already say that. Bhagavad Gita, at least in my judgment, first of all, is actually quite a unique text in the Indian tradition, because so much of the Indian tradition ends up inviting people in one way or the other to go beyond the manifested world, to the kind of remark of Christ that my kingdom is not of this world. So whatever one understands by that, but Bhagavad Gita, Krishna does not want Arjuna, who is the person whom he is teaching, to just leave this world, but to take care of this world also, to engage with this. So from that perspective, the Bhagavad Gita really is quite a unique text in the whole of the Indian tradition. But also, in addition to this, my own impression is, again, not everybody agrees with anything I say or anybody says. This is almost a requirement. But in my understanding, it's perhaps the most important text to emerge from India, one single text to emerge from India. And many other people have remarked on it in a very similar way. For example, Sri Aurobindo makes a similar remark, Aldous Huxley made a similar remark, Rudolf Steiner made a similar remark. So maybe even people outside India have been struck by this very much. So, so I'm largely going to base today's talk on the Bhagavad Gita. The word that is used for love in the Bhagavad Gita, which gets translated as love, is bhakti. But bhakti has very much a sense of devotion to it. It's not only love in the standard expression of this. And also, bhakti has almost an implied hierarchy in it. For example, Arjuna can have bhakti for Krishna, but it will be completely wrong expression to say that Krishna has bhakti for Arjuna. This is quite different from, first of all, maybe slightly backing up, that the word initially used in Sanskrit for love was kama, but by the time of, in the Rig Veda, but by the time of the Bhagavad Gita, which is essentially a modern text, a couple of thousand years old in India is a modern text. One needs to keep this in mind. And by the time of modern times in India, the word kama is deteriorated almost to mean selfish desire or even sexual love. Exactly the same thing happened with the word eros in Greek, which is the main word which is used, for example, by Socrates, saying that real philosophy can be undertaken only in a state of eros, or even Blavatsky says eros is the first fohat. And so the word eros is used to indicate love. But by the time of the New Testament, the word eros has become deteriorated. So other words are used. Agape and philia are the 2 main words used in the New Testament. But agape does not have that completely built-in kind of hierarchy that bhakti has. That is the point I wanted to make. That, for example, Christ, when he says he loves his disciples, he was used the word agape. Similarly, when it is said the disciples should love each other, again the word agape is used. Or even when the disciples may love Christ, again the word agape is used. But it is not possible to use the word bhakti in the same way. And also I should mention here, there is a tendency, particularly in a kind of a popular culture, that I love God or I love Krishna. There is a very strong emphasis from all the teachings I have already been emphasizing from Christ's remark, that what is more important is for us to be loved by Christ or loved by Krishna. Because when I say I love Krishna, I wonder what I'll get out of this. Will I get to heaven? Or will I enlarge in the world? There is always something implied result to come out of this. And furthermore, whatever I may understand something about Krishna from his teaching, strictly speaking, I don't know what Krishna is, or what Christ is, or what God is. Therefore, a very strong suggestion, and I quoted several times from the Gospels already, especially in John's Gospel, very much emphasized, that it is much more important that we are loved by Christ than that we love Christ. And he repeatedly makes this remark, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. Then I will love you and will dwell in you as the Father dwells in me. Repeatedly he has said this, particularly in John's Gospel. So always the call is not that I should be loving Krishna or Christ or God, but do I become worthy of being loved by them? And you will see much the same emphasis here again. But also to take a few other remarks about the word bhakti. The word bhakti also appears in the Rig Veda 8 times, but there it has quite a different meaning. It's more or less like participating or even eating. But sometimes, as you know, these expressions, for example, I love you so much I could eat you up. People can use that kind of expression. So it can therefore be implied like that, but love is not its implication in the Rig Veda. And also in the Bhagavad Gita, the word, although people keep saying love is the big thing, that's the important thing, the word bhakti does not even appear in the Bhagavad Gita until the last shloka in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And because a very strong emphasis by Krishna that unless one is engaged with right action, which is the karma yoga, he emphasizes 2 things in the first 6 chapters. Well, his teaching actually begins in the 2nd chapter. So if you like, in the first 5 chapters of his teaching, very much emphasizes right action and right knowledge, karma yoga and jnana yoga. Unless one is rightly engaged in action and has also, as I said, right knowledge, to imagine that I love Krishna is just fantasy. This is where most world wars have been created by religious warfare than by anything else. Everybody says, I love God, and then of course they have a unique God, and their God is not other people's God, and he doesn't love anybody else except them. So this is where all the problems come. So very strong emphasis in the Bhagavad Gita that until one has appropriately right action and right knowledge, any notion of loving God is just secondary. It's fantasy. Then, especially in the 12th chapter, Krishna says many times who are the people who are drawn to him, in that sense who come to him or love him, and who are loved by him. So I will now quote to you several of these. Well, first of all, beginning from the 7th chapter. Among the virtuous ones who turn to me with devotion and love, O Arjuna, there are 4 kinds of people. Those who are in distress, those who seek worldly goods, those who seek knowledge, and those who are wise. Of these, the wise, as you see, wise doesn't mean having knowledge. It has a different meaning. Just I'm slightly emphasizing this here. Of these, the wise, wholly devoted to and ever united with the divine, are the best. I am extremely dear, this word is used, is priya, to the wise, and they are dear to me. All these are noble, but I hold the wise who accept me as the highest goal and are integrated in the self as my very self. only through constant love can I be known and seen as I really am and entered into. Sometimes people slightly misunderstand this expression. Krishna is inviting people to enter into him, much like Christ remarked, if I love them, I will dwell in them as the Father dwells in me. But the perspective is not, you may be surprised, some theologians have written, was Christ a homosexual? You see what takes place, how one understands all this. By very, very strong implication or suggestion, Krishna repeatedly says that he is seated in everybody's heart, in everybody's mind, in everybody's body. So what is understood by Krishna is not a person with a certain image of whose picture we take. Krishna is the whole universal conscious energy. Similarly, God is not just what Michelangelo paints as the big with muscles in Sistine Chapel. This will be completely surprising. If God is not, we keep saying he's omnipresent, so he's right here, right in front of us, around us, behind us. So fantasize that he's just only up there in heaven with large big muscles is completely crazy. And every serious person in all the traditions have tried to say, to not misunderstood, to personify God like this. But I think I probably have already mentioned this to you. Einstein was particularly against this whole notion of personal God. In 1941, at a convocation address at Columbia University, I don't know why he chose it that occasion, but he made this remark that he hopes that the people who are authorities in the religious circles would have enough wisdom and enough courage to get rid of the idea of personal God. And many Protestant ministers, and actually some Jewish rabbis also, launched a campaign to send him back to Germany. This is in the middle of the Second World War. So you see how attached they are to the personal God. On the other hand, Einstein was not at all interested in that, and he was a great follower of Spinoza, actually. Spinoza also was bringing this perspective, and he was also excommunicated, and all his works were burned. So I remind you again and again that people get so attached to certain notions, and anybody who disagrees with this is excommunicated or burned or killed or something or the other. So let me come back to this again here. But Krishna is on the other hand saying that people come to him who are in distress or who is wishing some worldly goods, etc. So he's not necessarily dismissing that people also have those tendencies. When the self is serene and absorbed in Brahma, I'm sure by this time I have said this several times, Brahma is the label for the highest reality in the Indian context. Literally it means the vastness. One neither grieves nor desires. Impartial to all beings, one discovers supreme love for me. By love or bhakti, one comes to know me, who and what I am in essence. Knowing me in essence, one enters into me. Just as I remarked earlier, Christ said, I will dwell in them. Undertaking all actions, constantly trusting in me, one reaches the eternal and imperishable abode by my grace. O Arjuna, one who has taken a stand on oneness, ekatvam, this is an absolutely fundamental idea in the whole of the Indian tradition, oneness of all there is. Some of you were there last evening in the talk that I gave. The very strong emphasis in the Abrahamic tradition on the uniqueness of everything that is, and in the Indian tradition on the oneness of all there is. And I often invite people that obviously both are required. One needs to understand how not to dismiss what half the sages in the world have brought. How do we find an appropriate reconciliation of these kinds of remarks? Remarks get said, but let me remind you again and again, you can look either at the Buddha or at Christ. They love all their disciples, but they also have a beloved disciple. So there is a uniform love, but there is also unique love from both of them. Each one of them has a beloved disciple. Ananda in the case of the Buddha, and this may be, who is the beloved disciple for Christ? Mary. They don't accept that in the churches. I think you're right, but that. Anybody else?
Judas. Judas. Wasn't Judas the number one?
I don't think he was the most beloved disciple. He was his closest disciple in a way, that in his integrity, etc. So he calls him to play the role which others cannot play. Betrayal.
John.
No, John is usually considered in the Christian tradition as the beloved. But who was the one who he resurrected from the dead? Lazarus. Now, if you, at least when I read the Bible, several times it is said, even by Lazarus' sisters, oh, the one who loves you is going to come and save you. And even the Pharisees are saying this, here is the man whom he loved. So I actually concluded that Lazarus is the one who is the beloved disciple of Christ. Within 1 week of the publication of my book, I get a letter from the president of the Anthroposophical Society of USA, saying that that's exactly what Rudolf Steiner had come to that conclusion. Yes. So but don't take my word for it. I mean, I just read the Bible, not having been conditioned by the priests. So I just look at it, what seems to me rather obvious if you read the gospel, that Lazarus is the one. And to bring him from the death is rather interesting. St. Paul actually even makes this remark, that one who is not in touch with God is dead. So the word death is not to be taken so literal-mindedly as it gets taken, but it's also possible. There is no reason to deny this kind of great miracle, that Christ may have resurrected him from the dead. But it really, dead basically is talking about one who has completely forgotten any connection with God. Even in the Psalms you come to, therefore they call to awaken, to wake up, rise from the dead. This is one of the Psalms actually calls exactly like that. The yogi who has no egoism. The word yogi, by the way, especially in the context of the Bhagavad Gita, essentially is almost like saying a practitioner or a servant. The yogi who has no egoism and no selfishness, who has friendship and compassion. Sometimes I give some corresponding Sanskrit words because just one English word does not necessarily convey the whole richness of that. So karuna is the Sanskrit word. Has compassion for all beings and hatred for none, who is impartial to pain and pleasure and is forgiving, who is ever content, self-controlled and firm-willed, and whose mind and attention are given up to me, such a one is my devotee and is dear to me. I need to keep asking myself, do I correspond to any of this? Why should I bother to love me? One by whom the world is not troubled, also who is not troubled by the world, who is free from pleasure and resentment, fear and agitation, is dear to me. One who expects nothing, who is pure, capable, unattached, free from anxiety, who has given up all self-initiated undertakings, such a one is my devotee and is dear to me. To give up self-initiated undertakings, the corresponding word is lessness. I think I quoted once Krishnamurti. Always the call, but Krishna actually explicitly says the call for this kind of actionlessness that he's speaking about is not lack of action, but it is not my action, it's not my initiative, my undertaking or my desire, but can I become an instrument of Krishna's will? And this is more or less indicated here. Who has given up all self-initiated undertakings, such a one is my devotee and is dear to me. But Krishna actually even says that what he's calling for is not lack of action. In fact, then he says, if I were to stop, he says, I have nothing to gain, but if I were to stop acting, all these worlds will perish. So he's not saying lack of action, but actionlessness in the sense is not my action, not my initiative. Yes, you wanted to?
Oh yes, I was going to ask in Sanskrit if that's nishkama karma. Nishkama karma, no desire, action without a desire for fruit.
Yes, nishkam karma is a whole separate expression. That simply means nish meaning without, kam means selfish desire, karma means action. So desire or action without selfish desire or self-initiation, if you like. No, what I was speaking about was nash karmaya. That's a different expression.
Okay.
And that literally means, it's actually difficult to translate it. There are 2 or 3 possible translations into English. One is actionlessness, or the other one is action without actor. Now, see the difficulty with that.
Yeah.
But this is a
It's confusing because it almost sounds the same, but there is an R and a nish karmaya, and what you mentioned is it's nish.
Nishkama karma.
Yeah,
That's why I didn't understand.
No,
what you said.
nash karmaya or nish karma.
Nishkama karma.
Yeah. One who does my work, I hope you realize how many parallel remarks are with Christ's remarks saying, if you obey my commandments, then I will love you. It's a very different kind. One who does my work and has me as the supreme object, who is devoted to me and is free from attachment and is without enmity to any being, such a one comes to me, O Pandava. That's just the name of Arjuna. Arjuna is called by various names in the Bhagavad Gita. Pandava simply means son of Pandu. And exceedingly dear to me are those devotees who, full of Shraddha, carry out the eternal dharma described here and make me their one supreme aim. The word Shraddha almost always gets translated as faith. In fact, last evening, Karen was especially saying that. But Shraddha does not have the same kind of meaning of faith as it is in the biblical tradition. One needs to be very clear. One gets occupied with this word, but let me remind you again and again, every word, its meaning also depends on who is using it. What is the quality of the person who's having faith? Let me here quote to you a remark of Gurdjieff, where he says, faith of consciousness is freedom, faith of feeling is weakness, faith of body is stupidity. So now, he's not against faith. It depends on from what quality of consciousness or awareness it comes. Love, in the English language, what do we say? They're making love. What does it mean? Having sex. But is this what Christ means? Is this what Buddha is meaning? Or is this what Krishna is meaning. So one has to be very clear, not to get stuck with just this word means this. It depends on who is using it, or in what context it's being used. Always this is part of the trouble with the language, actually. Again and again one has to be very clear about this. Here I mention another difficulty of language, because particularly this is much more emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita than by Christ in the Gospels, although there also I will just show you some remarks of his. Very strong emphasis of becoming one with Krishna. Exactly similar remarks of Christ, in fact, although usually not quoted. Then the language has this problem, because in general what we understand by love requires two entities. So if there is essentially just one entity becoming one, then no longer it makes sense to use an expression saying Arjuna loves Krishna. If Arjuna is Krishna, what does it mean that he loves Krishna? So any expression of love requires two entities, but the call of the sages is to find our oneness with the mysterious that, labeled Brahma or God, the Father or Krishna. One can come to that realization essentially through love. However, at that level of oneness, the usual expression of loving something or somebody or being loved by someone loses meaning. So the language itself has naturally a problem. Another remark I should have probably made earlier about the whole emphasis on faith in the biblical tradition, I think I have more than once quoted to you. St. Paul even explicitly says that really the heart of the whole teaching is faith. And this is the call again and again. Whereas then he says faith is obedience of the will of God. A remark of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita is actually a chapter 63rd verse. A very well-known scientist said to me, this is his most favorite shloka in the Bhagavad Gita. And I was rather interested. This is what it says. He says, Krishna says to Arjuna, now I have taught you the profoundest of profound teaching. Reflect on everything without leaving anything out. But then do what you wish. He's not saying then obey my commandment. Then do what you wish. This scientist said this is his most favorite verse in the whole Bhagavad Gita. Reflect on everything without leaving anything out, but then do what you wish. This is 63rd shloka in the 18th chapter. So you see the meaning of faith in that context will be completely different. It doesn't mean just obeying what Krishna is saying, but reflecting on everything he's saying and then do what you understand or what you wish. The main expression of love in the Bhagavad Gita is complete union and merger of one with the other, a total removal of the otherness. Thus, love in the usual sense of the word and the world needing two is diminished in harmony with the entire Vedantist thought. There is ekam advitiyam, one, not two. This is an expression actually from the Chandogya Upanishad, repeatedly mentioned. There is the one without the other. But here I want to draw your attention to that you'll find similar kind of references or ideas also in the biblical tradition. So Krishna repeatedly exhorts searchers to come to his level of being. Sanskrit word is madbhav. My son said to me on one occasion, "Dad, it sounds like mad bhav." So he wanted me to spell it slightly differently. Otherwise, he says it. The Buddha said, "Look within, you are the Buddha." And then Gospel of Philip, obviously non-canonical. Christ came not to make us Christians, but to make us Christ. Saint Athanasius from the 2nd century, highly regarded saint, God became man so that we may become God. And then Meister Eckhart, every Christian is called to be Mary and give birth to the world. Angelo Silesius, his 18th century Dutch mystic, Christ may be born 1,000 times in Galilee, but all in vain until he is born in me. It is a repeated refrain of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita that he is seated in the heart of everyone. In fact, also in the body of everyone. I think I had quoted once to you. This is from the 17th chapter. Let me just quote that again here. This is what he says. Those who undertake severe austerities torment not only themselves, they torment me, who is seated in their body. This is Krishna's remark. Not recommending severe austerities. So then, in any case, coming back here, at the end of many births, a wise person comes to me, realizing that all there is Krishna. Such a person is a great soul and very rare. Obviously, not a very common experience of people. Even Christ makes this remark, many are called but few are chosen. Very few people can actually come to the kind of level these people invite us. Ultimately, it is not a relationship between two people or between human beings and God, as if these were two. Love is no longer a relationship, but it is the sine qua non of all relationships. Love is the reality manifesting itself as consciousness, truth, and delight. More than once I have quoted to you first letter of John, God is love, and he who dwells in love dwells in God. So again, simple reminder to say God is love is different from saying God is loving. It's not a characteristic of God, it is the very structure of God, which is really the point I'm trying to make here, that love is the reality manifesting itself as consciousness, truth, and delight. The very energy of our real love is divine and seeking itself. It is a particle of the divine in me which is seeking or loving the divine. There is a song that is sung in India and has become now the theme song of the Gurjeet group in India, which says, "What strange game you are playing with me, O Lord. You are the one seated in my heart, and you are seeking your..." This suggestion, I think, it obviously gets expressed in varieties of ways. Already we have been speaking about that a particle of divinity, we may call it soul, that takes on my body-mind. So it's already a particle of divinity that is searching for the divine or wishing to return to the divine. So it can get expressed in varieties of ways, soul, spirit. But what in me is keeping me, not only keeping me alive, but is calling me also to relate with or to assist the development towards the divine, is the particle of divinity. So in a way, this is important to come back to this again and again. But of course, the suggestion is that in each one of us, this particle of divinity is at a certain level, and it needs to evolve to come back to ultimately the highest level. Maybe a few dozen people in human history may have come to that level, but that's the call. Now here I will remind you that Christ makes really very closely similar remarks here. I especially recommend, particularly to all of my friends who have any interest in the Bible, really to read the 17th chapter carefully in the John's Gospel. That is often called Christ's last prayer. In my judgment, it is his report to God that you had sent me here, this is what I've done. So this is partly, you could call it his last prayer if you like, that's fine. This is a remark from that. O Father, most holy, keep them in your name which you have given to me, so that they may be one as we are. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, so that they may be perfected into one. So again and again I keep reminding you, this is actually the call. Not that just to become followers of Christ, ultimately to become one with Christ. Similarly, Krishna. And again, this is the call.
How is he giving that to them, Ravi?
Sorry. No?
How is he giving that to them? He says, keep which you have given to me, so that I have given them the glory that
Well,
you gave me.
he chose only 12 disciples to teach, and all that is the
I
giving.
see.
Yeah.
I see.
And in fact, in that very chapter, he also makes this remark, which most of my Christian friends get offended by when I quote this. He says, I do not pray for the whole world. This is Christ's remark. I pray for only those who you gave me. You can read it. Don't just take my word for it. I think it's just a fantasy to imagine that the whole world can be transformed. In fact, in general, I think I quoted to you the other day from the Upanishad, the whole process in the world is meant to be simply, it's like eating and excreting, being born and dying. That's the process. 8 billion people are there, 100 million will die in the next 1 year. And 100 million or more will be born, and the cycle will continue. Mother Earth has a very fecund womb and a very destructive jaw simultaneously. And anyone who wishes to awaken is against the universal law. This is the comment very much emphasized in the Upanishads, that the universal law is simply just maintaining this system going on. And that if anybody tries to awaken, then some devas will send somebody to seduce him or do something so that he can forget it. But occasionally somebody succeeds. But that is really, as it were, against the usual law. Again, this is why the suggestion is to be somehow to be lawless, to bypass the law, to become free of the law. But the law is said to be essentially this. That's the law. And it's easier for us to question this about human beings. What about all these billions of animals? Are they rising in their spiritual domain? Why the law applies to them and not to us? One needs to really seriously consider this. As far as I know, among the contemporary sages, Gurdjieff is the only one who actually literally, this is, now I'm quoting him, that anybody who wishes to wake up is this process is against nature, against the law of God. A direct quote from Guruji. So, but it is in a way breaking the law or becoming free of that law. That's the call, if you're interested spiritually. Christ said, "Not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my heavenly Father. You will dwell in my love if you keep my commandments, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and dwell in his love." I think I mentioned this on one occasion. You can read all the Gospels, canonical as well as non-canonical. Christ never says, "I love God." He always says, "I obey God." There is one possible exception where he actually makes both of these comments sort of simultaneously. "I love God whom I obey," something like this. That has been even questioned. But nowhere else he ever says that I love God. Always I obey God. And this is his call. Then I'm just inviting you that all those who claim to be followers and devotees of Krishna or of Christ will do well to recall the following. This is from first letter of John. The way we can be sure of our knowledge of him is to keep his commandments. The man who claims, "I have known him," without keeping his commandments is a liar. In such a one there is no truth. But whoever keeps his word, truly has the love of God been made perfect in him. The way we can be sure we are in union with him is for the man who claims to abide in him to conduct himself just as he did. So I ask all my Hindu friends, including myself, if I think what Krishna said is good, desirable, loving, do I actually follow his commandments? Similarly, I ask you, there are 3 billion Christians, are they all following what Christ taught? But we don't need to worry about what others do. Ask yourself about yourself. It's all these great prophets, Krishna, Buddha, Christ. What do we do with their teachings? As far as I understand, I'm probably saying completely obvious things, that Christ or the Buddha or Krishna, they are not teaching us what nirvana is or what the kingdom of heaven is, but how do we possibly become worthy of entering the kingdom of heaven or nirvana. So the call really is for practicing something rather than just believing Christ said that or the Buddha said that, Christ said that. Repeatedly, one needs to keep coming back to this, that what is required from our side, if we are touched or feel it important from what they are saying, what is required from our side is how do we carry out what they are saying, what they are. They are not just asking us, just believe and enter into heaven. Yes, Maria.
Yes, it seems that That's the call of our time, and it's the call of where we are in our own evolution, our own unfolding in the whole scheme, whether it's cosmic or individual. And that is to realize that we're called to live in two worlds at once, in a way. The world of oneness and the world of polarity, duality, where things appear to be separate. In some ways, we learn to live in both at one time. And the whole field of our becoming needs to be repolarized in a way, redirected into living in together in relationship, and all in that space where there's no relationship at all, only a kind of love, a kind of wisdom, as you've suggested, as all the great faiths have suggested. It's a momentous time for us.
Yes. Although, don't you have that impression that it has always been that kind of situation? After all, even 1,000 years ago, some people have some neighbors and who they are struggling with, and one king is attacking another king, as we are now doing. Israel attacking Gaza or whatever will go on. This has always been going on.
It has, but we have never been so awake and aware of how unawake we are.
And if you can honestly feel that out of 8 billion people, percentage-wise, more are now awake than they were 1,000 years ago, I would be very surprised. But I don't want to disagree with what you're saying. I think that is the call. But sadly, throughout human history, that call is forgotten. One is more or less self-occupied. It is true that these days we have more destructive weapons, and also the number of people is increased. I think I mentioned this more than once. Even 100 years ago, the population was less than half the population now in the world. Hardly 100 years ago. So when we are speaking about 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, population was not even 5% of the present population. So the numbers killed at that time may be just 10, and now they would have to be killing 1,000, but same proportion continues. Yeah.
I think it's in April, a man who really unpacks this well anthropologically, Peter Russell. But if you say indeed that the calling is breaking the law, right?
Right.
So we have a calling, but the calling is breaking the law, so why are we asking to wake up if it's not anthropological?
Now, see, this, when one says breaking the law, to be free of some laws. I have more than once given this example, very ordinary example. If somebody is mean to me in the morning, I don't want to have lunch with them. It's a law. Ordinary people like me react. But I personally have known some relatively wiser people who don't react like this. Even if a person is very critical of them, they don't mind him coming and sitting with them. So they are free of that law. So the suggestion is, when I say breaking the law may sound rather dramatic, it's really free of the laws that are usually running the universe.
So just as curiosity, what would be the purpose then? For the individual who maybe does cross the threshold, that you say, it says, not all who I ask do I let in.
Now the purpose, for example, then it will be possible, as it seems to have been for Christ, to be able to love even one's enemies. Otherwise, it is the law for guys like me. I can't love my enemies. So, in fact, there is a remark of St. Paul in the Bible, one who is connected with the Spirit is above the law. What does it mean? That in a way, supposing I said God is above the law, would you disagree with this? You see, but what does that mean? It's not that he's going out trying to break the laws, but essentially that he's not bound. He can be in this room as well as in the next room, but I can't be. He can go across the wall. I can't do that. I am stuck with many of the physical, geological, cosmological laws, psychological laws. Whereas a person who is free or spiritually advanced, extreme case would be God, he's not stuck with any of these laws. So to be lawless is another way of simply saying to be free of the laws that bind the usual kind of humanity. Usual humanity, I can guarantee, if somebody is mean to you, you can try it. I don't want to take it so personally, so let me say about me. If somebody is mean to me, it's not easy for me to be nice to them.
But it's an opportunity to practice.
It will require some great spiritual practice, then I might possibly become free of that law.
Yeah.
The word law does not need to be understood like a E equal to MC square kind of law. We are talking about law simply meaning what is the general reaction or action that takes place. Yeah.
How else do we discover our true nature unless we're willing to step outside of all the boxes, being guided by something deeper within us? That is how we discover trust and faith and courage, is to follow something so deep inside that is contrary to the way people are.
Yeah.
And that strengthens that. That gets us intimately familiar with those parts of trust and faith and courage and our own genius, because it's guiding us to that place. So it's almost like that's what shapes that clay into something that's uniquely individuated into God. How else do you do it? How else do you learn about trust and faith and courage? If you don't continue to go with something deep and profound within you, even when everybody's saying in different spiritual modalities and different psychological modalities, you break out of those molds, and all of a sudden, no, that's not what we do. Oh, but that's something very intimate in who I am, and I have to just keep going. So
now, what
always
you
being
have just said
challenged.
is basically what you're saying, that the spiritual element in you is under quite different laws than the physical element in you, right? That's all you just said. And basically, all that is being said in our conversation earlier, that if I'm just stuck with the laws governing my body and my mind, which basically means my fears and my desires, then I can't be free of them. So what you're calling us, that sometimes somebody is able to actually listen to a slightly subtler aspect in one. We may call it the spiritual aspect, or you can call it any other label. And then one can try to be a little free of these laws here, which are governing our usual attitudes, our usual body and mind.
And on top of that, it makes these more ethereal notions like trust and faith and courage more palpable, more real. It gives it a ground, a palpability.
No, I think we could all really agree with this, but don't forget the ordinary statistics. Just look around in the neighborhood where you are, or look at the world. Look at what is now taking place in the world. Are they corresponding to the kind of trust and wisdom that you're speaking about?
No, but that's no excuse for me to give in to all of that.
No, you don't. It's not an excuse for any of us to give in to this. But to imagine that it is something easy will be also crazy, simply because most people, I'm absolutely certain that at some time or the other, everybody feels that maybe there is some purpose to my life, I need to do something helpful, etc. But then other forces soon take over.
It has to live so strongly in you that you cannot deny it. And when I meet people and I feel that they're true seekers, I will engage them at this level. But when I don't feel that, this is not something you just take on. You know, it's not, I wouldn't encourage it for anybody unless they have to do this.
See, but my trouble is if I'm called to give a talk, as I am called here, can I expect everybody here to be driven by that inner spirit? Will that be a reasonable understanding on my part? Or do I have to see that there is a whole variety of people right even here? And this is already a select group.
Well, it's biased in the sense that we want to listen to you.
Let me come to a close to finish this so that we can have, some people probably are more wishing for a coffee break rather than okay, I suggest this if you wish to try it, but nobody is obliged to try any of this. How do you understand the statement that the part in you which loves the divine is itself divine? Is to bring really, as I said, your own insights or a different perspective. People don't, it's not a question of agreeing or disagreeing. Exchange among friends so that something is enlarged. Yeah.
Something about the Christian tradition, I think it's like obey me, and it feels like something outside trying to impose itself on me. Whereas what comes up inside is really what I follow. I don't follow these commandments. They ultimately probably do, but it springs up from inside. So I think there's this natural resistance and I find myself with the Indian stuff, with more of the Paushanats and Krishna, I feel more drawn to it because it's more about that inner. And I know with the Christian stuff, it's the inner too, but it's that imposing, that demand, follow my commandments. It's just kind of,
No, but you know,
it's outside of you.
One has to be a little careful because most of the searchers in India are likely to say the same about Hinduism. Namely, all these Pandits are just saying something or the other that you have to follow. The trouble is, we grow up at a certain place, you have encountered many more people with Christian background than with Hindu background. Inevitably, depending on where one grows up. So in a way, it is often understandable that one knows considerably more, knows not deeply, but impression of considerably more of the people around us than of people far away. And then if one is a little bit fed up what goes on here, oh, it must be wonderful over there. I can assure you, India has as many troubles and problems with their religion as Christianity does. Every religion has this issue because everywhere there are levels of human beings. Very few people are at the quality of level of Christ or the Buddha. But similarly, very few people are at the level of Hitler or Stalin or Putin or Trump. There is a whole range. There is a whole range. But we happen to know people around us much more, and therefore it seems other places must be more wonderful. And sometimes one, of course, encounters somebody. Personally, for me, the people who have more helped me to see more deeply have been people actually in the USA, believe it or not, coming from Christian background. They're not stuck with their religion, but they come from that background. But it is entirely possible that you encounter somebody in India coming from the Hindu background who brings something to you, touches you, invites you to see deeply. Why not? In fact, this is the particular advantage which has developed more and more since the Second World War. People can travel much more now than they used to earlier. Also, communication has increased so enormously that you can sit right here and find out what's taking place in India or in China or anywhere else. So the change that has taken place because of technology has made as if we are now in the whole globe all at once. For some people, they probably don't still feel that, but for some people, for example, I'm absolutely certain many more people have traveled to even to Europe from USA since the Second World War, percentage-wise, than they would have done earlier. So I think these technological changes can bring us closer to each other, but also they create other problems, bigger weapons, more killing, so all that is there. But I think nevertheless, whenever something is inside us is touched, the search is actually inside. It's not in India or Timbuktu. God is not in Jerusalem or Varanasi or Mecca. He's in here. You wanted to say something?
Yes. What I just wanted to share what helped me with making a little more being a little more friendly with the Christian tradition. That you mentioned the obey word is the odir, which I'm forgetting.
Yes, it comes from Latin oborir, having heard.
Having heard. It's not obey the way how we understand obey now, but having heard. It's much more, has a much more different flavor than obey, like what.
It's actually, in a way, one might say ironic, or I am very touched by this. Many, many people have said to me that they have come much closer to Christianity after having read my book on the Gospel of John. Because my intention there was not to be finding critical things to say about Christianity. I'm not really interested in proving this right or that wrong. I wasn't even going to write that book. I was just reading the Bible, and whenever I said anything to my friends who were of Christian background, they always said, well, that's not in the Bible. So then I'll show it to them. Then on one occasion somebody said, what the hell, we haven't heard all this, maybe you should write this as a book. I'm not a scholar, let me tell you, people, the trouble is, scholarship has somehow come out of me, but I'm not really, I have ended up writing more than a dozen books, but I'm not a writer, I'm not a scholar, I'm just searching for what strikes me as true. And then it depends on where I happen to be. So since I was in Canada, everybody around me claims to be a Christian, so I thought I better find out something about Christianity. And then they would invite me to have interreligious dialogues. So I was considered a Hindu since I was from India. And you will be surprised, I learned more about Hinduism after 1 year in Canada than I learned in India, just because I had to say something publicly. So I went back and studied the Hindu scriptures. So I ended up then studying the Bhagavad Gita, which I didn't bother to study when I was in India. So just because they were inviting me in the so-called Hindu-Christian dialogue, so I'm being a Hindu, representing Hinduism, so I thought I better know something about it. This might surprise you people, but that's my life story. But I'm not trying to prove anything to anybody, I'm just myself searching. And then somebody sooner or later says, well, hell, you should publish it because people don't think like this. So.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. About the slide, if you could take a moment with that.
Can we
slide.
go back to the slides,
Thank you.
Annie?
Sorry.
I think the one you're interested in is
Yes.
this one.
So, madbhav, bhava means a flavor, mood, correct? So
No.
I'm feeling. Thank you.
Bhav can mean essence, it can mean feeling also, it has several different meanings to it. But madbhav meaning my being. So Krishna is inviting us to be to his level of being, madbhav.
And the fourth, the God became man, so we may become God. If you could elaborate
What?
it, how you understand
No,
that. It would be-
I think I have in slightly other words, have repeatedly said that according to the spiritual teaching, the very reason why a particle of divinity, let's call it a soul, has taken on my body so that I can undertake appropriate actions so that this particle of divinity at whatever level it now is can enhance in its quality, ultimately coming to God. So what Saint Athanasius is saying, God became man, meaning so through Christ the teaching has been brought so that we can rise and become God, come to the level of God. But that is the general feeling in all spiritual teachings, that the purpose of the soul taking on the body and the mind, that these are the instruments to do the right action. So this is another reason I keep emphasizing there is absolutely no reason to be against the body or the mind. Are the instruments. Why be against the instrument? But the trouble is, one can get so occupied that the desires and the fears of the instrument takes over. Did you want to say something more about this slide?
I'm good, thank you. I don't want But thank you, that was really helpful. So it basically says, God entered into man like the divine particles inside, so we may become unified or and
closer to the
yes,
Spirit
yes,
of
yes.
God.
Thank you.
But he was very highly regarded saint in the Christian tradition. But generally, these kinds of remarks are not very much emphasized in the Christian tradition.
Ravi, I was curious that I haven't yet, I think, seen you remark on Muhammad's words or the Muslim teaching, and I just wonder if there was a reason for that, or
No, partly because here, in the gathering here, most people are of Judeo-Christian background. And secondly, actually people often don't realize that partly because there have been warfare between Christians and Muslims starting in the 10th century, initiated by the Pope, by the way, not by the Muslims. This is, I think if you look at the history of this, but people forget that within Islam, in Orthodox Islam, Christ is regarded as a greater prophet than Prophet Muhammad. But Prophet Muhammad is the last of the prophets. So that's a different thing. But on the other hand, in Islam, although Christ is a greater prophet than Prophet Muhammad, but he's not regarded as equivalent to God. So it's not that he's one with God. That would be regarded heresy. Well, even in Christianity, that was considered heretical, so he's crucified. But in the whole Abrahamic tradition, that whole notion is unacceptable in general. But as I, on the other hand, point out, I just quoted to you Meister Eckhart or Angelo Silesius, that for them, that is really the call. And for Christ also, he's saying he's trying to bring his disciples to that level, to be one with us. But in the organizational part of Christianity, for long back, that was removed. And also, if you just read the Bible, you don't find any kind of discussion about Trinity or eternal soul or everlasting soul, etc. These are all ideas arising later on from the Nicene Creed onward. Nicene creeds, there are actually 7 different creeds, and they were all initiated by the king, not by the Pope. Did not even attend there are 7 councils, and the Pope did not even attend any of those 7 councils, but his representatives did attend the last 3 councils. But they were all initiated or organized by the king, initially by Constantine, and then following other kings afterwards. So it has, then one of the things that I have tried to point out here, in Christianity, for a very long time, the secular power and religious powers were very much intermixed, brought together. So the king could decide who the Pope would be. For example, Emperor Justinian actually imprisoned the Pope because Pope believed in the idea of reincarnation. This is in the 6th century. But the king did not want to have this idea, so Pope refused to deny this, so he imprisoned the Pope and forced him to deny this. And it's the consequence of that. You look from the 16th century onwards, every part of the globe has been controlled by people of Christian background, whether they're coming from Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, Germany, UK, USA, take any, all of Christian background, ruling the whole planet. Why? Are they bringing more wisdom than the others are? Or why are they doing it? It's because of this combination of the religious and secular powers together. So I think it's good to try to see this clearly, and then quite understandably China and India naturally wish to be free of this. And people often forget, if you just add the population, I often remind my friends here, you take the whole population of North America, Mexico, USA, Canada, plus the whole population of Europe, put together, it is still less than the population of India. So, to be all of them to be controlled by the British Empire and trying to, billions of dollars are spent by the evangelical Christians in USA to prove how Hinduism is just terrible, they are just worshipping cows and dogs and cats, and they should become Christians. Billions of dollars they spend on this every year. So the present government has now actually banned getting this money being transferred to India. And so you don't realize what goes on in the name of religion. It's just absolutely fantastic. Religion has done more harm to spiritual search than any other institution. More organized it is, more harm it does. It doesn't want to encourage search, just want you to believe something. No, it's very tragic actually. But if you look at history, on the other hand, one also realizes that organizations are so helpful. For example, when there are floods or disasters, the churches can help poor people to give them accommodation, and also over centuries. I mean, look at the great cathedrals in Europe especially. Fantastic cathedrals, and also frescoes and music. And so there is no reason to be against anything. Everything has its place. Even the devil has his place. Yeah.
Can you talk more, Ravindra, about action without actor, about Nash Karmaya?
Nash Karmaya really is actionlessness. Now, then as I said, sometimes when I was trying to translate this, I said maybe it'll be like action without myself being the actor. So when one says actor-less action, it's not, I mean, it doesn't make any logical sense. But the point really is that it's not being initiated by me. It's not my desire or my goal or my aim, but can I actually become an instrument? In this context, it will be instrument of Krishna's will. In the context of a Christian language, instrument of Christ's will or God's will. But Krishna actually says that he's not asking for, in fact, this may sound like a joke to you people. I was about, if I recall, 10 or 11 years old. And in my family, they were often talking about these kind of things. So I said, they keep talking about this Nash Karma. Maybe why don't they just practice it? So I went down and I lay down in a bed that I'm not going to do any action. This is how I understood it, you see. So after a few hours, I was feeling hungry. So I got up, trying to go to the kitchen. My mother said, no, actionlessness. So you see what level one understands this. So gradually I understood that I still have to eat to survive.
So does the concept of surrender come in, understanding that it's not my will, but thy will, thine?
Yes.
So this Sharanagati concept of ultimate surrender to be an instrument to work for the...
Exactly. That's the call. And Krishna, in fact, even says that it does not mean lack of action. In fact, then he says himself, I don't have anything to gain by my action, but if I were to stop working, all these worlds will perish. And then he says one cannot even survive without some action, which is true. That was my own experience. I could not survive without some action.
So, I don't know if it translates the same, but it's action without intention or action without self-seeking motive?
Self-seeking mode, yeah.
But that's different than the nishkama karma I always understood growing up was the idea of selfless service. And so that part of the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna not being concerned with the fruit of your action. But this is like the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
One is to surrender so that there is no my small self will, only large self, your will. And the other is when I engage in action to then surrender the fruit of the action without any selfish desire.
Yeah, that's true.
But
Yeah.
the idea of nishkam karma really is, in fact, again, if you don't mind my giving a very personal example here, I was about 28 years old, so this is a hell of a long time ago. And I was taking some art lessons from an art teacher. And I still remember the very first day, there were 5 or 6 of us students taking these lessons. The very first day, I'm sort of wondering, when can my paintings hang in the National Art Gallery? I still remember this very strongly. So you see, that is the call for nishkam karma, that not to be so occupied with the result of this. And then Krishna actually even explicitly says later on, later chapters, that there are many factors that are involved in the result of some action. Of course, the quality of the action, quality of the actor is relevant, but he says there is something called daivam. Now, daivam literally means will of the devas. Deva, you could say angels. It's hard to translate the word deva, but higher level of beings. So he says there is daivam, and it certainly, look at historically, given my physics background, I give you there were at least a dozen people who had exactly the same data that Einstein had. But why is it that he comes up with a theory which the others are not able to come up with? Now, one could say it's just accident. Of course, if you want to say that, that's okay, it's just accident. But from the point of view of Krishna, that there is some input from higher sources. Devam is the Sanskrit expression for this. And that everybody may have the same data, but somebody comes up with a theory and others are immediately surprised. In fact, some of them compete. And if you know the history of all this, you will see it's naturally there is competition because they are not getting the Nobel Prize. Only Einstein is getting it. So they are missing something, but they had the same data also earlier. Then they may even claim that we had already produced this theory but had not yet published it. That also sometimes happens.
Ravi, didn't he also say that something came to him in a dream? Einstein.
Not often they use the word intuition, sometimes maybe even a dream. In fact, practically even the great poets or artists, scientists, all of them say something came to them in intuition. Maybe the word dream may be used also. This is not surprising. In fact, at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, I was rather a little surprised to see many of the people. You have to be invited to be a member there. You don't apply or something like this. I was invited by Freeman Dyson because I had asked some question, etc. But in any case, I was a member there for some time in 1977. I was so surprised that many of the people would come to their office. they will be at the board or writing something, maybe for half an hour or so. And then they go out in the woods just walking around. Very large woods around in the Institute of Advanced Study. Something as if one needs to try something, do something, but then allow something to enter into you, to come to you. Very strong suggestion. So many of these people would say they had a feeling or they had an intuition, but of course, unlike in the arts, in physics, then they have to bring the mind that can actually express this in the acceptable language of usually mathematics, or even before starting going to mathematics, just getting some what ideas can be expressed. Whereas in poetry, often the tendency is the poet will just change the language or use a word which is not the usual meaning of the word, etc. Or some people would just write small, only even don't use capital letters. So this is the way of conveying something different. Rick, yes, please.
Yes, I've heard it said, and I've experienced it myself one time, of without thinking about it beforehand, hearing myself speak something which made perfect sense and in fact determined what I would do for the next little while.
Yeah.
And the astounding impression of hearing oneself speak about something that one had no intention to say. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't letting something out that was a secret, it was something entirely new.
Well, as you know, really there is a repeated suggestion, especially in the spiritual teachings much more than elsewhere, that in principle the whole cosmos is mirrored inside us, or that we are a hologram of the whole universe. So there are really many levels. If it is true that all levels are in principle in me, imagine in the Bible we have 9 orders of angels. So they are also mirrored in me somewhere. So if occasionally something in me is freed at a low level, that I am not wholly stuck with something, I can hear a voice from elsewhere which is also within me. So, but the trouble is, in general, we are so occupied with our actions and what is going on around me, etc., that we don't have that emptiness of the mind which can also receive something, which is why repeated emphasis in all spiritual teachings to quieten the mind. In fact, in the Yoga Sutra is the first substantial sutra, which is the second sutra in the first chapter. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is stopping the movements of the mind. That's the whole purpose of yoga. Because of this understanding that there are many levels of reality subtler than the mind. In fact, personally, the more and more as I think about this, my impression is that the very word spiritual means something that the mind cannot grasp it. It's subtler than the mind. Therefore, all the mental agitation about it, whether God is Trinity or Unity or whether He is this or that, sometimes it can help people to search for something beyond this, but sometimes it just gets occupied with this, arguing with each other about this. Yes? Somebody else.
Andrea, you had your hand up at some stage.
I did, but we'll let this woman in the corner go. She was.
Yes, it's often been said there's nothing greater than an idea its time has come. And I mean, in the instance of electricity with Tesla and Edison, I've been told that an idea or thought or invention or something gets let loose in the universe, and then it is the very thing that somebody that can take it to fruition that gets that done. I mean, myself, my father used to say if I had $1 for every great idea you have, you'd be a billionaire. I just could never finish or do anything that I thought of. So I'm just wondering that if you agree that those great things are out there And if you're open and if you have the will and the power and the initiative to do it, then you get there first, is what happens, is how a discovery gets made or something, because it's all out there.
Not only out there, but also in here.
Right.
Yeah, this is important to keep in mind, because from the point of view of spiritual searchers, this is actually almost the fundamental difference between what has happened with science, starting from the 16th century onward, largely because the organized religions were destroying the scientists. It's not coming from science. As you probably, most of you know, Giordano Bruno, who came up with the idea of what we would these days call exoplanets. That's not the label he had, but there are other planets. And they said, well, that would mean Christ would have to be born again to be another planet. So he was burnt at the stake. Galileo was incarcerated. Descartes was poisoned and died. Kepler's mother was tried as a witch, so he had to give up his position. I have just mentioned to you 3 or 4 most important scientists of that time. So it was the religious people who were giving the trouble. Galileo even made this remark, which is actually not his own remark, he was quoting somebody else. The Bible shows how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. That what science was going to find out how the heavens was a way of referring to the planets, how the heavens go. But religions, whole organized religion, very much worked against it completely. Later on, Newton, who did not believe in the Trinity, so he could not become the head of the Trinity College, which is where the... I tell you, I could give you many examples. All the damage has been done from the religious organization rather than by the scientific side. But on the other hand, the suggestion that you were saying it's out there, but it's a way of speaking, but it's also in here. The very strong science became almost wholly occupied searching outside. Everything gets looking here, there, even at other people, but not at oneself. Whereas in the spiritual teaching, the call is to look within. So it really becomes a different enterprise. Yeah, you wanted to say.
Well, I've heard and I've experienced that, and I'm sure many of us have who have an asana practice, a yoga asana practice, that the medicine is not in the pose. The medicine is in the energy that is released when one is in the experience of the pose.
Yes.
The prana, and the prana is the energy from within. So it's not the external pose itself, it's what one releases within the experience that is the energy that flows.
Yes, you see, from the spiritual perspective, even the action, if you like, since it comes from the spiritual side, then it manifests something in our psyche, then the fundamental relationship with the feeling. So the very idea that feelings influence the body rather than that the body influences the feeling. In the medical system, hardly 15 years ago, when they began to even recognize that if you have feeling oppressed or some torture or something, that it can create some bodily problems. From the spiritual point of view, it's the other way around. It's not that the body is primarily creating all this, it's the spirit affecting the psyche, psyche affecting the feeling, then affecting the body. It's a different direction. Yes.
So that reminds me of, well, I'll ask a different question because I think Jean covered it. So I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned earlier about Jesus's favorite disciple, and that got me thinking about something that you said in your memoir about Madame de Salzman, and you said something like she had this grief about not being able to help her students get it, and something else about how each teacher usually has a favorite pupil that they they may have a lot of pupils, but they'll have one pupil that they pour a lot of their energy and effort into. And I was just wondering if you could speak more about that.
I don't really know whether I have much to say about it, but if you, certainly it's a common expression, for example, in Buddhism, that Ananda, one of the disciples of the Buddha, was his favorite disciple. Similarly, we may agree whether who is the favorite disciple in the Christian context, as I earlier said, but nevertheless, so in a way one could say that Christ is loving all his disciples, but obviously he also can see that each one is unique. So somebody he feels closer to him, in that sense more lovable. But this would hardly be surprising really in any, even in any university class. You see some people, there may be 20 people in the class, but somebody is more listening very carefully and is understanding more. So a teacher can sometimes easily recognize this. So we may not use the same kind of words in the university classes like beloved disciple. That has become very old-fashioned expression. But certainly every teacher sooner or later recognizes that some students are more likely to grasp something quickly than others. So beloved really only in that sense.
Do you think that sense of grief that you spoke of with Madame de Salzman is common among teachers?
Say that again?
The sense of grief, do you remember when in your memoir you spoke about the sense of grief that, I don't know if grief is the word you used, but a sense of sadness that the pupils weren't getting it. Do you think that that's pervasive among teachers?
Yeah, my impression is practically, well, personally I don't know really what Christ actually felt or what the Buddha felt, but I would be surprised if they were not sometimes feeling sad that very few people understand what they are saying. Because in a way they are spending all of their time and energy trying to convey something, but certainly among the teachers that I have actually met, for example, Krishnamurti, certainly, so on some occasion, in fact I even use that expression in my book. He was almost like a wounded doe. Sometimes it looked very sad, just looking at him. Similarly, actually, Madame de Salzman even describes that on occasion, Guruji will be sitting somewhere looking at the people, seeing just like they're just walking around like machines. And he felt very sad and would almost cry, just looking at the way the human beings are behaving. And on one occasion, when she was describing it, she herself had tears in her eyes. Actually, I think something in me completely instinctively, I mean, she was more than twice my age. I stood up and I just held her arm as it were to console her, which seems very strange in a way to come, but it was just completely instinctive. Because looking at the human situation, they felt very sad what's going on in the world. I think we should probably stop. It's nearly noon. Soon we shall see the moon. Okay. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.